is bringing up a universal law that God has put into effect here. And there are these universal laws that God has subjected the entire universe to. For example, the law of gravity. If something goes up, what's it going to do? It's going to come down, right? And there is nothing in this universe here and on this world that is not subjected to that. It doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter where you come from, doesn't matter your background. You go up, you're going to fall back down. Another universal law is what we see here in Galatians chapter 6. He says, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, this he will also reap." That's life. That's just the way life works. Now, we get this, there's a very physical application to that. If I go out and I sow a field of corn, I can't expect to reap a harvest of watermelon, can I? It's not going to happen, right? You sow corn, you're going to reap corn. That's the way that works. But this is not just good agriculture business. This isn't, Ag 101 at school. This is about life. This is about a universal principle here that it doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter where you've been, doesn't matter how you grew up or what your background is. Whatever you sow, this is how you're going to reap. Okay? And so, if we're going to sow to the flesh, the Bible tells us here that we will from the flesh reap corruption. Now that sounds bad. We don't want to reap a harvest of corruption, but let's think about this for a minute. If I sow in the flesh, if I apply myself diligently to, let's say, a job or to my business, okay, and I've got good work ethic and I'm responsible, I'm consistent, and I put forth a good effort, I should expect to reap a harvest of my labor, correct? Now, is there anything wrong with that? No, that's a good thing, right? And so when he says reap corruption, he doesn't mean we're going to reap something really bad and awful. He means we're going to reap something that is corruptible. Something that is not permanent, not eternal, but a temporary harvest. One that will not last. And we're contrasting that to if we sow in the Spirit, we will from the Spirit reap a harvest that is what? Eternal. Eternal. And so, just like planting corn, not going to reap a harvest of watermelon, if I invest myself, if I sow only in the flesh, I should not expect an eternal spiritual reward for that. Right. Now, Paul is writing this to the churches in Galatia. And what we need to realize and understand, these were Christian people. These are people that Paul invested about 3 years of his life with. He taught them. He shared his life with them. He shared the gospel with them. These are people that came to faith, obeyed the gospel from their faith. They had Christ. They were Christian people. And he's writing to the church. And he says, guys, don't be deceived. God will not be mocked. If you are going to sow in the flesh, don't expect eternal spiritual reward. He's not writing to the world. And see, what has happened is that the church in the Galatia area there, what they did is they began something in faith. And as time went on, they have begun to drop faith off, and they are focusing now on the physical, on a system of works rather than a system that is based on faith. And in chapter 3 of Galatians, in verse 3, Paul says, "Are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh?" And see, that's what they were doing. They began something in faith. They began, their Christianity there with a faith-based system. But over time, what has happened is they have put the emphasis and the focus on the flesh, on the physical, on the temporary. And I bring this up today, this last year, since January, I don't really preach in the congregation back home. I don't really preach a sermon series, but I kind of sometimes go on themes for a while, and kind of build on that. And we've been talking this year about, as a group of Christians, as the church, are we going to actually be the church? The church of Jesus Christ, the group of people who are living as a group of people who belong to Christ, that will abandon ourselves so that Christ may increase, that we could actually say it's no longer I who live, but it's Christ who lives within me. Are we going to be that dynamic group of people that is bringing life and hope into a world that is sick and dying and broken? Or are we just going to be a group of people who come to a church building once a week? See, and the difference between those two things is tremendous. I mean, it's all the difference, really. And so we come to this point about this is that we know that faith produces what? works, am I right? Right? So faith without works is, maybe that was a better way to say that, right? Faith without works is dead. And so, faith will produce works. And the reason this is tricky is that we have a very real potential of putting the focus on the works because they can look so similar, a work-based system or a faith-based system. And so that's what we're going to talk about this morning is what we're doing as a Christian, is what you personally are doing as a Christian. Is it faith-based or is it work-based? Okay, and so when we, I'll give you an example of this and why this is such an important thing to try to evaluate. If you think back into Genesis there with the account of Cain and Abel, right? Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel, the Bible tells us in Genesis 4 that they both came to present offerings to the Lord. And we know that the Lord found favor, right, with who? Abel. Yeah, but then he rejected who? Cain. Now, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall. You know what I mean? I wish that we could have just been there to watch because, if we were there and we were standing by and we watched that day what happened, we would have seen the same works out of both those people, wouldn't we? They both brought an offering to the Lord. And I wouldn't have been able to see anything different in what Cain did and what Abel did. I've heard people try to discuss that the difference was in the type of offering, and they try to tie that in with the law, with the grain or the animal. The law didn't exist yet. Okay, so they would have known, that one would have been different than but they both brought an offering to the Lord. But God accepts one and he rejects the other. And if we were there that day, we would not have been able to physically see a difference between what Cain did and what Abel did. But God tells us, not right away, but he tells us all the way when we get into the book of Hebrews in chapter 11 and verse 4, he tells us what the difference was. That faith, or Abel by what? By faith, offered a better sacrifice, a better offering. And so what God could see, appearance, and if we judge only based on appearance, all we can see is what we can see, the physical. And so, 2 Corinthians 13:5 says that we are to test ourselves to see whether we are in the faith. Okay? And if we want to be, if we want to make a difference, in our own lives and the lives around us, if we want to make an impact in Reno, an impact in your home, an impact on your street, an impact in the workplace, an impact at the school, whatever you're going to do, we've got to get focused on faith. Right? We can't drop faith off and then put all the emphasis then on the works. And so we're going to talk about three things here this morning that we can use to evaluate that in our own life. Now, and this isn't about trying to evaluate everybody else. This isn't about trying to look at the congregation. This is about looking at you personally, what you are doing. Is it faith-based or is it work-based? Okay? And the first thing is this. What's the priority? What's the focus? What is getting the emphasis in your life? Now, we know that faith is the substance, right? The evidence, the assurance, the conviction of things hoped for and things not seen, right? We know that we walk by faith and not by sight. Exactly. We're told there in 2 Corinthians that we are to look not at what is seen, but what is unseen. Because what's seen is temporary, right? But what is not seen is eternal. And so, when we think about what gets the priority in our life, are we putting the emphasis on the spiritual things or on the physical things? A faith-based system cannot emphasize the physical because faith does not focus and look at what is seen. Right? It's always looking at what's inside. We're always looking at the spiritual things here. But a system of works, right, a work-based system is going to put all the priority on what we see. Right? The appearance. Right? On the works. And I want you to understand that when that begins to happen, okay, when we begin to drop faith off and focus and put the emphasis on the physical, we end up getting a very twisted perspective of what God's doing. Right? Keep in mind that God often works in the physical to teach us spiritual concepts. For example, we have earthly marriage so that we can understand what it means to be the bride of Christ. Right? We had in the Old Testament a physical temple so that now we can go back and look and see, we can understand what it means to be that temple, right? To be that sanctuary for God. And so, there's all these physical things that God was doing so that He could make a spiritual point. But what happens if we put all the emphasis on the physical and we never get around to the spiritual point? Right? We begin to get a really twisted idea of what God was really trying to do. And so, For example, and we're going to be in Luke chapter 6 here in just a second, if you want to go ahead and turn there. But, I think a good example of this is with the Pharisees, of course, in the New Testament. They were very works-based, very law-based, very physical-based. And, what they did is they were trying to take that Old Testament law that God gave us, and, they kind of had the mentality, well, thank goodness that God has us here, because God just wasn't specific enough to get His point across. And so they were really trying to hone in and get down to the nitty-gritty details, and they started adding all these traditions, and they're enforcing these traditions as doctrine, and they're really making this a tremendous burden. But, the Sabbath day, right, in Exodus chapter 20, one of the 10 Commandments, God says that we're to keep the Sabbath day holy, right? And they're to remember the Sabbath day. Now, if you go through and you start reading through the Old Testament, God, not that He doesn't have anything to say about the Sabbath day, but really there's not that much details there about it. God doesn't get all that much more specific than that. Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. Now the Sabbath day, of course, was the seventh day. God worked for 6 days. There on the seventh day, He rested from those labors. They were to work, they could work 6 days, and the seventh day they were to rest from their labors. And so that's kind of the principle that He's bringing around. Now, of course, our Sabbath day is not Sunday. The Lord's day is not the Christian Sabbath. Who knows what the Christian Sabbath is? There we go, heaven, yeah, Hebrews chapter 4, our Sabbath awaits, right, or when we cease from our works. So, but this was an Old Testament principle. And so the Pharisees, they started adding and getting specific and trying to add all their details to it. And they came up with traditions like cutting your fingernails, right? That you're breaking the Sabbath if you're cutting your fingernails on the Sabbath. You're guilty of doing some sort of work now. Right now, you see how twisted that's getting? They said that, if you walked around with heavy shoes on your feet, you're guilty of carrying a burden. Okay? And you broke the Sabbath. And now you laugh, that's ridiculous, isn't it? See, it's twisted. Okay, they said that if you spit on the dirt, and that spit makes any kind of indentation in the dirt, you're guilty now of trying to dig a trench. Work. Okay, so you see, they took a principle, and what did God focus on? He said, remember the Sabbath and keep it what? Holy. Keep it holy. And what did they focus on? Don't work. It wasn't about being holy, right? It wasn't about keeping it holy. It wasn't about having a day set apart for God. It was about don't work. That became the emphasis. So in Luke chapter 6, this is what we begin to see here. Beginning in verse 1, he says, now it happened that he was passing through some grain fields on a Sabbath. His disciples were picking the heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands, and eating the grain. Some of the Pharisees said, why do you do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? This is what they're doing. Jesus, the disciples, they're walking through. They're seeing some wheat there, and they're grabbing it with their hand. They're rubbing it together to kind of blowing the chaff away, and they're eating the grain. And the Pharisees, as far as they're concerned, plucking that little piece of wheat there as you're walking by, well, that's reaping, right? You've worked. Rubbing it together, man, that's threshing. Guilty of work. Right? And so, they're putting the siren on, trying to pull Jesus and the disciples over and saying, guys, you guys get a ticket. You broke the law. And like I said, it's twisted, right? It's a very twisted perspective because the emphasis is on the wrong things. Now, we begin to see that, that system of works and system based on the physical bad perspective. How many in here have been in a congregation that was more concerned about the building than the people? Oh, come on now, yeah. Right? How many here have been in a congregation that is more worried about what you're wearing on Sunday than how you're living on Monday? Yeah? Okay. There was a congregation a while back there, I've come in and I'm teaching, and I had a coffee mug. I set it to get you run out of some places. You know that? Desecrating this holy table. Right? This table, well, we're holy, right? God's holy, piece of furniture. But we get the emphasis on the wrong things. I was in a congregation several years ago, and it was a dying congregation. There was about 12 people in there when I came into it, and it was about like preaching to a funeral every Sunday, just no life there, right? But we start reaching out. We start winning some younger people, some college-age kids, some high school kids. We start getting these guys in there. They're coming on Sunday night. They're coming on Wednesday night. They're coming in Sunday school. They're sitting right up front every Sunday, and it's getting to where the tables are turning. We're getting more younger people in there than the 12 or 13 that had been there their whole life. And the leaders came to me and they actually told me, they said, Ethan, we've got to stop putting all the focus here on these younger people. They're not the ones giving. Isn't that sick? Now, their souls aren't valuable because they ain't got any money. See, that's what happens. We get the focus on the wrong things. That's what a work-based system is going to produce, okay? And so the wrong things become the important things. The important things become neglected things. All right? And so a system of works is only going to focus on what we see. And I think about there in Matthew chapter 5, when Jesus was there preaching, he talked about things that they heard through the Old Testament. He said, you've heard it said, do not commit murder. Right? Well, that was one of the 10 Commandments. They all knew that. But what did Jesus do? He drove that point inward. He said, it's not just about whether you kill somebody, is it? He says, if you've got hatred in your heart, you're guilty of murder. And so he's taken, he says, let's not just focus on what are we doing, but let's focus on the condition of the heart there. And then he said, you've all heard it said not to commit adultery. And what he brings, it's not just about whether you're out sleeping around. If you've got lust bound up in your heart, you're guilty. And so he's driving these points inward. He's trying to get it on the inside. Not just about what are we doing, what are we producing, but what is going on the inside of a person. And I think about all those 10 Commandments there. We've got the Sabbath day, we've got murder and adultery. You guys remember, it wasn't that awful long ago, it's still kind of going on, where everybody was all upset and worried because we were going to pull the 10 Commandments down out of courthouses. And was that a big thing out here? It wasn't a big thing out here? Jim, you remember though, don't you? So everyone else can pretend that you know what I'm talking about. Everyone was upset because we're going to pull the 10 Commandments out of some courthouses and some school systems. And they start putting up these big yard signs, and everyone's trying to get them hanging up everywhere and stuff. And it was just a big ordeal. A lot of religious groups out there trying to get these things. But I want you to think about that. In 1973, no one was trying to pull the 10 Commandments out of a courthouse. And there, right underneath thou shalt not murder, we passed Roe versus Wade and gave women the right to abort their own children. How effective is it? Having it posted up. If we don't get it in the hearts of people, it's not going to do any good. And I think about the original 10 Commandments, not the ones that were smashed, but the second copy that Moses brought off the mountain. What did he do with them? Did he hang them up somewhere and post them out for everyone to see? They went in the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant went to the Holy of Holies. One guy was able to walk in there one time a year and he couldn't open the box, right? Nobody saw them. They weren't posted anywhere. But were they effective? The people knew them. Right? And that's my point. If we're going to be effective, we've got to drive these things inward. Right? We've got to get them in the hearts of people. It can't just be about the physical and the flesh. We got to move on beyond that. And so, there in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 2, it says, set your minds on the things above, not on the things that are of earth. So the second thing that I want us to consider here is we're evaluating, is what we're doing, is it faith-based or is it based in the physical? The second thing, the first is what was the focus? What's the priority? The second is, what are we trying to accomplish? Okay, what's our goal? What are we trying to accomplish? Now, again, that's tricky because what does faith produce? Works. It should produce work. Faith and works have to go together. And so, but the priority needs to be on the spiritual rather than the physical. Let me word this a different way. Are my works spiritual or physical? Okay? That's probably not clearing that up any better, is it? Well, the answer to that, though, it all depends on what we're trying to accomplish. What is the motivation? What is the end goal here? Okay, so, an example that I think is very physical, very apparent, very obvious is church attendance. Okay, we can all see that. You can look around, you can see who's here, you can see who's not here. It can be a very physical thing. But is it a spiritual thing or a physical thing? Well, that again depends on what you're here for. Right? I mean, if your goal is simply, I have to come to church because that's what I'm supposed to do, and so if I can sit and tolerate the lesson and the sermon, ingest some juice and a cracker, then I can go home and I can cross that off the list for the week. Now, is that a spiritual or is that a physical mindset? Physical. Right? If your only goal is to fill a pew for an hour, right? That's not faith-based. However, what we're told in Hebrews chapter 10, what our attendance can accomplish. Okay, in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 23, he says this, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. He who promised is faithful, and let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, not forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another all the more as you see the day drawing near." Now, what can our assembly accomplish? Well, he says, one, we consider one another. Right? We think about one another. Right? We become spiritually sensitive to what other people are going through. You know, we pray for one another. Right? It says that we're here to encourage one another, to motivate one another, to stimulate to love and to good deeds. He says that we can hold fast our confession of faith without wavering. We can be consistent. We can be stable. We can stand firm. Now, if I'm here because that's what I'm wanting to accomplish, is that faith-based or work-based? It's faith-based. Now, me being here, that's a very physical thing, but I'm trying to accomplish something in here. You know, my goal is what it's going to produce in here. And see, that's faith. That's doing what the Lord commands us to do and trusting that He's going to do and produce what He's promised it will produce. All right, so it's a faith-based system or it's a work-based system. It all depends on your motivation, right? On your goal, what you're trying to accomplish. Now, we know that God wants to accomplish work inside, right? In Romans chapter 12, verse 2, "Do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the" what? Renewing of your mind, right? Not a renewing, of your physical schedule, and not a renewing of where you're parking yourself on a Sunday morning, whether it's in here or in front of the TV. A renewing of your mind, because if we can change the mind, if we can change our thought processes, if we can change, our character from the inside, what will that eventually change? What we're doing, what we're producing, right? And so the Lord's, He's putting that emphasis on the inside. That's where we target. That's what He's trying to drive those points inward. And so, you change a mind, it's going to change your action. You change character, it's going to change your behavior. Now, you can try to change actions without changing people's minds. Is it effective? No. It may work for a short time. It won't be consistent. It certainly won't be lasting. Okay? And that's why a system of works will always fail in changing the inner person, right? It always fail in that transformation that God's trying to accomplish. And that is why, people can come to the church building every Sunday all their life and never grow and never change, never want to do anything for the Lord. That's why lost people can sit in and hear the gospel proclaimed to them week after week after week after week and never make a decision, because they're just sitting in a church building week after week. That's all they're doing. That's all they're wanting to do. That's all they're trying to accomplish. They have no further inward spiritual goal than just fill the pew for an hour or so on a Sunday morning. So we have to have that ambition. I want to be pleasing to God always, right? We've got to come to the Lord with that mindset. Where else can we go? You alone have the words of eternal life. We've got to get that in our heads. This kind of self-abandonment idea that it'll be Christ within me and not no longer myself. That's what we're trying to accomplish here, an inward change. That being said, and knowing that a system of works and a system of faith can have the same appearance, we can't throw out the works just because we're afraid to put the focus on it, can we? But you can use the works as a gauge to kind of evaluate where the faith and the spiritual part is sometimes. For example, we watch Cain and Abel bring their offering. We don't know whether they're doing it by faith or not. But if only Abel showed up and Cain was on the golf course that day, we get a pretty good indicator of where Cain's at compared to Abel, don't we? You see what I mean? So like I said, we can sometimes use that physical as the gauge, right? So we can't throw works out just because we're afraid to get focused on that or afraid to become, a little legalistic or something. The goal is to figure out where this matches up and keep the emphasis where it belongs. What does obedience produce when we obey because of our faith? Now, the last thing here that we can use to evaluate this, what's important, where's the priority, what are we trying to accomplish, and the third one is, are we growing? Because a works-based system will not allow for growth. It won't happen.
That's right.
Can't happen. Give you an example. Years ago, I was attending a congregation. We had a softball league. Do you guys do that around here? It's big around our area. You know, everyone's wanting to do the softball church leagues. They had some rules in place, some laws. You know, if you wanted to play softball on the church team, there's some rules to follow. And here's the rules. All players must attend church on a regular basis. Now, is that a bad rule? No, that's not bad. But then they go on, kind of like the Pharisees, to fine-tune that and define what regular means. Regular is a week. If we've got four weeks in a month, let's get the calculators out. How many meetings we have to be here? Could be here 16 times, but regular means you got to be here at least 2 of those. That's a different message, I guess. But my point, though, is what did that produce? It produced a lot of people that would show up 2 times out of the month, and then I don't have to come back because I've done all I have to, right? I've met the requirement to be on the softball league. And what it produced is people in the church going out and trying to win the lost by saying, hey, come play softball with us. You only have to come to the church meeting twice this month, and then you can be on the team, right? So they join the team, and when softball's over, guess what? Bye-bye. We don't see them again. And so, that's what this can produce, not growth, right? But that's what a system of works produces, that mindset of I only have to do the bare minimum requirement. In Matthew 18, 21, 22, Peter asked, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? And Jesus said to him, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but 70 times 7. What's Peter wanting to know? Yeah, what do I have to do? Right? How many times do I have to forgive this guy until I'm off the hook here and I can write him off? What is the bare minimum requirement that I have to be a nice person? How many times do I have to treat this person like a human being until I can, forget that? What's the bare minimum? And so the answer is, well, not 7, 70 times 7. Now, no joke, I've had people come to me and they've done the math. Yeah. And they said, all right, so I guess I have to forgive this person 490 times. Is that right? No. No. I didn't become a preacher because I'm good at math. They missed the point, didn't they? Yeah, he's not trying to give us a 400 and whatever. That's going to be your minimum requirement. He's trying to say, Peter, let's stop worrying about what we have to do, right? Let's start being, just human beings with one another, right? Let's talk about, doing the right thing for the right reason for once, right? And in Luke chapter 10, the lawyer comes up to Jesus, right? And he says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And, Jesus says, well, you know the law, you've read it. How's it read to you? And he brings up, well, you love the Lord, right? And then you love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, yeah, that pretty well sums it up. And then he asks the question, what? All right, who's my neighbor then? If that's what it takes, then I need to know who's my neighbor. And the Bible even says he was looking to justify himself. And it's the same idea. Jesus, who do I have to love? Because heaven forbid I do anything more than that. Heaven forbid I overextend myself and love someone I don't have to. Who do I have to treat as my neighbor? Right? That's what a works-based system is going to produce. Right? It's a really sad mentality. And again, you go back to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. He said, go the extra mile. Right? He says, if someone comes to and he says, give them your cloak also. Jesus is trying to emphasize, let's go beyond the bare minimum requirement. Let's go beyond what I have to do. Let's get out of that mindset of what we have to do. Let's start thinking about what can we do. Right? Well, what can we do? And so, a system of works, it will not allow for growth because you're never going to take that next step because you don't have to. You've already filled the quota. You've already did, and that's what kills me. I hear people say sometimes about the Lord, well, it's the least we can do. Now, we need to get that out of our vocabulary. We need to start thinking about what's the most we can do for the Lord. Not the least that we can do for people, not the least that we can do for Jesus, not the least that we can do in the kingdom. We need to get beyond that. A system of works, the mentality is this: I win when I get to keep the most for myself, and Jesus gets very, very little. Now, culturally different, I get that, so I'm going to take a stab in